We're proud to stand with some of the strongest advocates for civil rights, including the representatives from the NAACP of New Jersey. And I want to start off my remarks today with a few words about our junior senator, because this past week reminded us how fortunate we are to have Cory Booker be New Jersey's voice on the Senate Judiciary Committee. This past week, Cory faced a near impossible task, which was to speak truth in a process designed to conceal the truth. You stood up for the right of Americans to understand Brett Kavanaugh's views, and you exposed the process that was rigged to hide documents about his record, not because they posed a risk to national security or revealed overly sensitive information, but rather because they would confirm Americans' gravest fears about what his confirmation would mean for the future of this country. And you took a risk, and it was a risk that when we're talking about a lifetime appointment to the highest court in the land, I think I can say on behalf not just of all New Jerseyans, but all Americans, thank you for taking that risk, Cory. It showed incredible leadership. Thank you, Senator Booker, for your leadership. We all remember the quote from Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. when he said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but that it bends towards justice. Well, if Brett Kavanaugh is confirmed to the Supreme Court, he is all but certain to bend the arc of justice backwards to a time and place that none of us want to go back to. America has come a long way from the dark days of segregation and Jim Crow, but in recent years we've had no shortage of reminders that our nation's long struggle with hate is far from over. We have seen a wave of voter suppression laws that disproportionately deny people of color access to the ballot box. We've witnessed white supremacists commit violence in Charlottesville. We're living through tremendous uncertainty and division under the presidency of Donald Trump. This is a president who stokes racial hatred for political gain on a regular basis, who thinks being wealthy is the same thing as being worthy, who judges immigrants on the color of their skin and the nation of their origin, who has asked the Department of Justice to prosecute his political enemies, who stokes racial division and fear on a regular basis, who is under investigation for accepting the assistance of a foreign power in his election, and whose administration is actively undermining anti-discrimination laws we need to protect the rights of women, people of color, the LGBTQ Americans in education, healthcare, housing, consumer protection, and countless other areas. So it's strangely ironic that in the last year and a half, the only thing that has stood between Donald Trump and his most nationalistic, xenophobic, and vindictive politics has often been the courts. More than 2,000 children would still be separated from their parents but for a federal judge ordering the administration to reunite them. And still, there are too many who are not reunited. Untraceable, undetectable 3D printed guns could have become the weapon of choice for criminals and terrorists but for a federal judge who stepped in after the State Department green-lighted the publication of the blueprints online. Legitimate voters in Kansas who couldn't prove their citizenship would be barred from the ballot box if a federal court hadn't defended their constitutional right to vote. And other hugely consequential issues are before the courts as we speak. There's a case in Texas where the Trump administration is arguing that the Affordable Care Act's protections for pre-existing conditions are unconstitutional. In a state that has 3.8 million New Jerseyans who have a pre-existing condition that we fought to protect against the discrimination by insurance companies, that case is monumental. There's an ongoing legal battle that could result in the deportation of 800,000 dreamers from the only country they've ever known and loved. These are the kind of tremendously consequential issues that are likely to come before the Supreme Court during the next justice's tenure. In other words, Justice Kavanaugh could be the justice who upholds Donald Trump's most disgraceful policies and sets back our nation's progress for a generation. Democrats have been accused of somehow exaggerating the threat that Brett Kavanaugh poses to the rights of women to make their own health care decisions, to the rights of workers to organize and bargain for safer working conditions, to the right of people to vote. But these concerns are not invented out of thin air. You only have to look at Brett Kavanaugh's record on the D.C. Court of Appeals to see that he is the most anti-civil rights, anti-woman, anti-worker, and anti-immigrant nominee in recent history. His record on voting rights reveals that he is complicit in a deeply partisan effort to suppress the rights of legitimate voters under the guise of combating nearly non-existent voter fraud. He has ignored Supreme Court precedent and the intent of Congress by ruling that undocumented immigrants could not form a union under the National Labor Relations Act. He has joined opinions that undermine our fair housing laws and weaken the ability of African Americans and Latino Americans to raise discrimination claims against practices that disproportionately disadvantage minority communities. Brett Kavanaugh spent his entire career in Republican politics. He was groomed for the courts by right-wing groups like the Heritage Foundation and the Federalist Society that are funded by big corporations and wealthy CEOs. And I fear his confirmation could create lasting damage to America's trust in the Supreme Court for years to come. We're witnessing a right-wing heist that began when Republicans brazenly refused to consider a nominee put forward by President Obama with more than 9 months left in office. A heist that continued with the confirmation of Justice Neil Gorsuch this year, and has now given President Trump a narrow window to remake the Supreme Court in his own image. At a time like this, Americans need a Supreme Court justice who will protect our civil rights and adhere to our highest ideals. Ultimately, Kavanaugh's record reveals either a stunning ignorance of our nation's painful struggles with race or an ideological quest to tip the scales of justice in favor of the rich and powerful. That's why, as advocates for racial justice, equal rights under the law, opportunity for all, we pledge to oppose this nomination and fight back against the Trump administration's every effort to turn back the clock on civil rights. And in that fight, we couldn't have a stronger advocate, a more powerful voice, someone who is willing to put political capital on the table to make it clear that the consequences of this nomination are not just another judge, but is a potentially damaging decision for a generation of cases that we want to see progress move forward, not backward. And if I have to have someone defending my rights and my civil rights and my opportunity for a better future, I couldn't ask for a better person on the Senate Judiciary Committee than Senator Cory Booker.